way to temptation. And again, if I could remind you of one simple thing, that sin and temptation doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen all at once. And even though we call it the fall, it's far from a fall. It was a walk down the park into sinfulness. And if you have wondered, are there consequences to sin? If you are ever tempted to sin, or if your family is tempted to choose to be disobedient to the Lord, to live selfishly, just remind them of Genesis chapter 4. Because one of the big messages that comes out of Genesis chapter 4, even though it's not in verse 1 or verse 2 in a particular phrase in the chapter, is that exactly what the Lord said in Genesis chapter happened. Remember what the promise was? That sin will bring death. Sin brings death. The wages of sin is death, according to the book of Romans. And the first death in the Bible, in terms of human beings, is not the death of Adam and Eve, though they were the first people to sin. And so they would have rightfully assumed, they should have assumed that, well, if we sin, then I guess God is probably going to kill us. Because if you think of the threat, the promise, the day that you eat from the fruit of this tree, you will surely die. And so they sinned, and maybe Adam was thinking that when he was there with his wife, and they didn't turn themselves into the authorities, of course, thinking that by the end of the day that God would carry out his promise of judgment. And he didn't. And God is way more gracious to Adam and Eve than they ever could have anticipated. And in a strange sense, and I don't mean this as a compliment to him, Satan was right. And again, I'm not saying that he was good and God was bad or anything like that, but he said God's not going to kill you. And even though they began the process of dying, the clock started ticking, and their death would be imminent at some point, that Satan knew something about the mercy of God, even as his enemy. What did Satan know about the mercy of God? Well, when he rebelled against God, Satan, Lucifer, I should be calling him then, could have been struck dead, but God didn't even strike Lucifer dead. He gave him time to live. I don't know, I was going to say opportunity, but that's not a good one. He certainly gave him a length of time. And so when the serpent comes to the woman and says, no, you won't surely die, he was speaking from experience, because he didn't surely die when he sinned against God. And it's essentially the same thing that you see with Jonah when he goes to Nineveh. When Jonah goes to Nineveh, he doesn't want to preach to them, and his big complaint against God is what? I knew you were a pushover. I knew you wouldn't judge them. And so the Lord had to give him a lesson about judgment. And so the judgment that comes in Genesis chapter 4 is what God said was true in chapter 2. But the striking thing is that it didn't happen to them, it happened to their children. It's really a powerful lesson to think through. When the Lord said that sin brings death, and the first person who died was not Adam or Eve, it was the good one, if you will, the child of noble character whose name was Abel. It's interesting that the name Abel comes from the Hebrew word hevel, and hevel is the word that means vanity or breath or vapor. And that's probably why his name was called that, and that's why the word hevel means vanity. And so when you read in the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, you're speaking the word Abel. Hevel of Hevelim, which is Abel of Abel, all of life is vanity. And the tragedy about Abel here is simply that his life was a vapor. And his life was a vapor because of the sinfulness of all of the rest of his family. Certainly mom and dad, right? They played a part into what happened to him. And also a brother who ended up killing him because his brother was jealous and didn't like what he was doing there. It's striking that when we come to Genesis chapter 4, that's what my Bible is. I'm going to read it here in just a moment, a couple more comments, that quite a bit of time has gone by because these little boys are adults. They have grown up. and apparently they are married or within the possibility of being married. Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, the Bible tells us. So even though we're only told of three, Cain and Abel and Seth, Adam had several, Adam and Eve together. The rabbis, not that they know for sure, but sometimes things were passed down, they claimed that Adam and Eve had 50 children. So just a tradition, extra biblical tradition, probably not too far away from the truth of the situation. And so it was certainly true that Cain, when he was sent away, which we'll talk about next Sunday, was sent away with one of his sisters. As striking as that is for us to say today, how could that be the case? But the gene pool was still perfect at that time. And frankly, if you think about it, every single one of us, my wife is here, we're actually related anyways, even before we got married, right? And so were you and the people that you were married to. And so each of us marries a relative in that regard. Now, Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. Rather than come back to it, I'll just mention it as we read here. The word Cain means to acquire, to get something. And so when Adam and Eve came together and had sexual relations, and she conceived, she bore a son, and she called him the one acquired. Which, if you're thinking, you would say, well, what seed was she looking for? And you remember in Genesis chapter 3, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and you and her seed and your seed. Let me read that there, so I read it correctly. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. She was looking for the one to come and destroy the serpent and the devil who was behind him. And so when it says that she has acquired a man, she thinks that Cain is her deliverer. Pretty clear about that. And there's two reasons why I would say that. First of all, because of the name. Cain means the one acquired. In other words, this is the fulfillment of the promise, at least in her thinking. And in the Hebrew language, when it says, when you look at it in your version, I've acquired a man from the Lord, there's a different way that the Hebrew is rendered here, and it literally might even say that he is the Lord. Now, she's wrong about that, but she doesn't know much about who this is, and so I would say if you want a number of certainty with 75 or 80% certainty, she thinks that Cain is the promised child who will be the one who will come and rescue mom and dad and family from this serpent, which might even explain why he's so spoiled. Firstborn child, right? And she thinks he's the deliverer, and who knows how that would have all played into everything that was there. And so she says, I've acquired a man from the Lord. And then she bore again, and this time her brother Vanity was born, Vapor, Abel. And now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And it came to pass in the process of time, or my version says, in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground to the Lord, and Abel also brought a firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. Whenever you see the fat portions, that's an Old Testament way of saying the very best cut, the very best part of it, because they view the fat portion as the best portion. The second thing you'll notice in the text is in verse 3. I think this is really significant. You wouldn't even notice this in your English language, but it's really something. The words in the process of time literally read. I could read it in the Hebrew, and in the end of days. And when you hear the word end of days, you think like, the final time before the Lord comes. But the end of days means at the end of a set amount of time. And so what that means when it says, and in the process of time, or at the end of days, chapter 4 and verse 3, the first 6 words there, it means that there was a set time for them to come together. And people often debate about that. Did they know that they should come? Did they have instruction about coming and worshiping the Lord? Was it expected of them? And this verse tells me, since it says at the end of time, it means at the appointed time, or when the time was up, they came together. Now, that gives us a huge understanding of what they would have understood or known about what it means to worship the Lord. If there is a set time for them to worship, people have said, well, maybe it's the Sabbath. That would make sense as a logical possibility, or it might have been at the end of a season or at the end of the year. Whatever the case was, we know that they were expected to come, that it was determined, and it would have been by the Lord that they come and worship Him together. And so it's not just willy-nilly. Cain wakes up one morning and, what should I do today? I guess I'll go get some corn and some tomatoes and put it in a cornucopia and bring it to the Lord, which would have been fine. Nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, that's not wrong. But if this is a set time, if this is an appointed time, and it is, then it means that God had spoken to them and had given them revelation about the fact that it's important that they come and worship the Lord. So what else do you think would have been included in any instruction that the Lord would have given to Cain and Abel if He set the right time? Probably would have said the right manner of bringing worship. He might have talked about the right kind of sacrifice, right? Doesn't that make sense? All those things would be there. And the reason that to me is really important is because ideas travel through the Christian church, through evangelicalism, and one of the ideas that's been going around for about 30 years is this question: did it matter that Cain brought a non-bloody sacrifice and Cain brought a bloody one, or was the issue the attitude of the heart? And I've had debates with many people, younger budding theologians, if you will, pastors, trying to convince them that it matters that this was blood. And one of the ways that I would argue for the fact that it was more than just the attitude of Cain and Abel, clearly Cain's attitude is terrible, is the fact that if this was a set time, and I think that it is a set time, there would have been set regulations, things that would have been expected. And so for Cain to show up with a basket of fruit or vegetables and think that the Lord would accept that would have been the ultimate of offense against the Lord. I believe that that's absolutely the case, that it was an offense. By the way, when you come to the book of Genesis and you try and understand what it means, it's important to put yourself into the original audience. The original audience of the book of Genesis is who? Well, it's the children of Israel after they left Mount Sinai, and probably after they wandered around the wilderness as they're getting ready to go into the land of Canaan. So we would call that Mount Nebo. What happened on Mount Nebo? That's where Moses was called up by the Lord. And as he was called up there around Mount Nebo, the people were gathered to him at one point. The Lord gave him revelations about the things that had happened, Genesis through Deuteronomy. That might have happened in Mount Sinai too, of course. But Moses died there. Moses died in the plains of Moab, overlooking the Jordan River, seeing the land of Israel. And it says that the Lord showed him those things. And I think when it says that the Lord showed him the land, that it wasn't just that he said, oh, look over there. I think he would have given him insight and maybe even, given him extended vision to see those things. But the people that would have received the whole book of Genesis were the children of Israel. Does that tell you anything about what kind of a sacrifice they would have expected from the Lord? The children of Israel had just finished, not too long before that, celebrating the Passover. What happened in the Passover to people who didn't shed blood and put it on their doorposts? Well, they lost their firstborn. And so they were experiencing this whole concept of blood, and the Lord had established the whole priestly system and all of the sacrifices. And so if Moses gets up there and he's reading the scroll, this is what the Lord just told me up on the mountain. Let me tell you what's going on. And he gets to chapter 4, and he tells the children of Israel, that's really important, the children of Israel, that Cain brought some fruit. They would have done what Jews do today, which is grab dust and throw it up in the air, and they would have gone, oh, vey, I can't believe that anyone would be so wicked as to bring something he did rather than the life of an individual. And so I think it's really important to understand all those things from verse 3. So I'm still in the middle of reading here, by the way. Let's keep reading. And so at the end of time, the process of days, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground to the Lord, and Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat. In other words, the very best one he had, the best portion. And the Lord respected, or had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. Notice the double object of respect. It wasn't just the offering itself that the Lord gave some manner of approval to or some manner of disapproval to. It was to the person. And so each of them would intuitively or instinctively or maybe even obviously would have recognized the Lord likes what I did or the Lord doesn't like what I did. Now, in other times when the Lord had respect to an offering, he would send down fire. So it's possible that that's what we would see there. It's possible that maybe the Shekinah glory of God came over the sacrifice, or maybe the Lord just spoke with them. Doesn't really say, we don't really know, but clearly both of them knew where they stood with God. Cain was not right with God, and Abel was right with God because he brought the right kind of sacrifice, and he brought the best portion, and he brought it with the right motives. And so we see in verse 6 what we see all through the Bible, and I really made a point of this in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, that God is a seeking God. Remember that? God comes to seek those who fall into sin. And God could have simply wiped Cain off the face of the earth. I gave you an opportunity. And by the way, the Bible teaches capital punishment, doesn't it? Seems like that's the case. But God did not even enact capital punishment on Cain, who killed his brother. Quite striking that that's the case. And so the mercy or the grace of God just continues to someone here by the name of Cain, which is really striking. So the Lord comes and he says to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, then sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, and you must rule over it." That is an exact quote of chapter 3 and verse 16, when when God tells exactly the same thing to Eve. That's an important verse. We won't look at it now. And now Cain talked to Abel his brother. Wouldn't you like to know what they talked about? The Hebrew there is interesting. Now, Cain spoke with his brother Abel. And so maybe he set up an appointment. Maybe they wandered in the field. He had something to say to him. Don't really know. But he spoke with them, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. I've often wondered if he even knew what it was to murder. No one had ever murdered before, other than they had seen the Lord shed blood in the garden, at least mom and dad had. So maybe he didn't even realize, possibly, if that's the case, if he didn't understand how a life would die, then we could say that maybe he committed manslaughter instead of murder, except for the fact that since Abel had been already raising sheep, either he was raising sheep for the purpose of just clothing of wool. Maybe he was raising them because that was something that was already on the diet. It's not as likely, but it certainly is possible. So the Lord God said to Cain in verse 9, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the idea behind that is, am I the shepherd's shepherd? Do I have to shepherd him? He's a shepherd. He doesn't need me to be shepherding him along the way. And he said, "What have you done?" And again, notice what the Lord does here in terms of questions. It's not that the Lord needs information himself. He's wondering what happened. He knows all about it, but he wants Cain to repent. He wants him to turn around. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, and so now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Only person who feels sorry for Cain is himself, and he wants more mercy. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground, and I will be hidden from your face, and I will be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. Apparently there's already people in other places by now. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. And the striking thing is there, one act of mercy upon another one was placed upon Cain by the Lord at this time. So let's take a look at it. We've got about 10 minutes, and we'll kind of rehearse a little bit of that, and then we'll move forward. The first thing that we could say about the account is clearly it was a set time of worship. I think that's pretty obvious, at least clear. Maybe not obvious. Let me take the word obvious back. I think it's extremely likely that it was a set time of worship, and in the set time of worship, they knew that they needed to come as an act of faith and worship the Lord. The second thing that we notice about the sacrifices is the difference between Cain and Abel's sacrifice. The first one is that one was bloody and one wasn't. I think that's really huge. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins, the book of Hebrews said. Adam and Eve had seen the Lord shed blood to cover them and make tunics for them. And so everyone would have known that the shedding of blood was necessary. And so that says something about both Cain and about Abel. It really says, number one, the most about the faith that either they did have or they didn't have. How can I tell whether or not Cain and Abel had faith in God? Well, those who have faith in God want to worship Him. They want to love Him. They want to come by His standards. They want to honor Him. And they want to give Him the best of their lives. And so as a response of faith, this is why Abel came and offered what he offered to the Lord. He looked around and found the very best of the sheep that he could find, and he offered it to the Lord as an act of faith, and the Lord accepted it. The important thing about faith is that if we don't have faith, if we don't come in faith, it is impossible for us to please God. He that comes to the Lord must believe two things about Him. That He is real, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Which means, I know that there is a real God, and I know that this real God will respond to anyone who pursues Him with the right heart. So that's the essence of faith. I know that God is a merciful God and a gracious God, a forgiving God. It's a part of the relationship there. And so Abel comes, first of all, by the way, sets a good example, and he manifests the fact that he's truly worshiping the Lord. By the way, who is Cain worshiping? It would be the natural assumption to saying that Cain is worshiping the Lord, but what does he bring? Well, if I ask you to go and collect some gifts and to prepare to give it to someone, and you went and you got something that would be helpful for the person or something appropriate, then you would say, well, they are caring for the object of their worship or the object of their concern. If you ran out and you got all of the best pictures you had of yourself, if you got your paintings, if you got a sweater that you had, sewn together, which every single item that you brought to give away is a reflection of you, then who are you worshiping? You're clearly worshiping yourself. And so when Cain comes along and he brings the fruits that he has grown, he's essentially doing what a farmer would do, is he's taking delight in his ability to grow things. It'd be like giving the Lord a basket of fruit, a basket of apples. We've seen so much and talked about apples recently. Just giving something, that you've done so that the Lord would look at you and be, amazed at what you've done there. And of course, the Lord didn't have any interest in that whatsoever. And so what it reveals about Cain is that Cain's problem is he doesn't love the Lord, he doesn't worship the Lord, he doesn't believe the Lord, he doesn't obey the Lord. And so he didn't bring blood, he brought that which reflected on his own self-righteousness rather than on the righteousness which God grants to people. This is really an important time to talk about the idea of alien righteousness. Alien righteousness is just simply a way for us to identify how it is that we stand right before God. We stand right before God not based on any righteousness that we would ever have, but on the righteousness that comes from outside of our universe. Outside of our, think of the word alien, they come outside. Outside of our universe, God comes and grants us righteousness. Abel had the righteousness that he would receive because he responded in faith. In fact, what does Hebrews say about it? By faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain in Hebrews chapter 11. And so Abel came with alien righteousness, and Cain came with his self-righteousness. And by the way, you would say, well, that's really interesting. Where in the world would he get the idea that he could do something himself that would make himself good enough? And then you go all the way back to the stories of what mom and dad did when they fell into sin and they knew that they were unrighteous in the Garden of Eden. When they fell into sin, what did they do? They hid themselves. Who did they hide from? Well, there was no one in the garden but each other at first, and so they're hiding from each other, and then they're hiding from God. That's what sin does to you. It causes you to be alienated and hide from people. And so they made for themselves girdles. Tunics was the word there that was used. Girdle is the right word, not the word tunic. Self-righteousness of fig leaves to think that they could stand before God in their own works. Cain is doing exactly the same thing that Adam and Eve did in the garden. Coming was not that they even had an opportunity. How would they know what to do? But it's just a natural propensity in our lives to bring what we have before the Lord. And I need to stop and make an important observation for us as we're here this morning, and you all love the Lord, and I love the Lord, and we want to serve Him and whatnot. But it's even easy for believers to think that the Lord is pleased with the things that we do, and we present our good works, our efforts, maybe singing or whatever we do this morning, maybe a sermon or whatever it is, and think that the Lord is pleased because of the things that we've done, when the truth is we come into His presence because He loves us. Because He loves us, He wants us to feel welcome in His presence. Lord comes along, therefore, and after He greets Cain, it's important to know that the murder hasn't happened yet. And so did Cain have an opportunity at this point to rethink his problem and fix the situation and make it better? Absolutely. Now, we don't know exactly where Cain's heart was. We think of terms of like being saved or unsaved. It seems like Cain probably was not saved, if you want to say it that way, born again. But the truth is, when the Lord came and warned him about his error, any person in their right mind would have listened to the Lord. And the problem with us is we often don't listen to the Lord. He who loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates correction, according to Proverbs 12:1, is stupid. So we could say about Cain that when the Lord warned him, He says, I'm going to give you a mulligan. You get a do-over. You get a second chance. If you do right, then that will be great. But if you don't do right, then you're going to be in trouble. And this is where we should look at verse 7, because verse 7 is really significant. So Genesis 4:7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? In other words, I'll still accept you. There's no problem here. We can fix it. And if you do not do well, then sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should master over it. Now, what he's describing here is the violence or the power of sin, and he describes sin like a roaring lion. Sin is lying at the door. And this is why it's so significant, because when you read back into it and see what the Lord told to Eve in her discipline, the same thing is true here. When he says that sin lies at the door, it's like, well, would you step outside the door if there was a lion hiding right behind the tree ready to pounce on you? You say, well, no, I wouldn't do that whatsoever. You would find a way to avoid that situation. He's telling us that about sin. Sin is like a roaring lion, just like Satan is like a roaring lion, and it wants to destroy you. I was watching just a video yesterday about, I think it was the taipan, the most venomous snake in the world. Does that sound right? I think it was. And so this lady calls the snake removal people, and she's outside the door, and the snake's inside the house in Australia. And the guy just walks right in, and he's got his little stick, and he walks right up to the thing, and of course, it's kind of an aggressive snake in the way that it kind of like moves around and darts in his direction and other directions. And I was thinking, well, the last thing I would ever do is go into a house where there's a snake there that's ready to kill me. Apparently he knew what he was doing, and it was just fine. But that's exactly what we do when we flirt with sin. And we flirt with sin, and sin wants to destroy you in multiple ways. If you were an unbeliever, it certainly wants to destroy them and send them to hell. But sin even wants to do exactly the same thing for a believer. And so the warning here, the mercy here that the Lord gives to Cain is simply, I'll give you one more chance, at least one more chance, and if you do well, then everything will be fine. Notice the response of a wicked heart. A wicked heart is simply this: a person who doesn't want to be corrected, who really never did love the Lord in the first place, decides that he's going to do something in spite of the Lord. And I think it's really profound. Essentially what Cain does here to the Lord is simply, oh, so you want a blood sacrifice, huh? You want an innocent little lamb, and that would make you happy? I'll give you blood. I'll give you more valuable blood. I'll give you a blood of a greater price than you have even asked of me. And by striking his brother and killing his brother, he is essentially carrying out the letter of the commands to bring a blood sacrifice, with not at all carrying out the heart of what it means to worship the Lord. And so he sacrifices, he slaughters his brother, and not really offers it up directly, but by leaving him out in the field to die, spites God in terrible ways, and kills his brother as a means to hate the Lord. Remember this about whenever we harm another person, the person that we're really harming is the Lord. Years and years ago, this is when it first struck me, when my wife and I lived in North Hills at the time. We had a picture of the president at the time, whose name was Bill Clinton. It was up in the kitchen, and I used to think about throwing darts at that picture. And it occurred to me finally, after I was convicted about that if I wouldn't throw darts at the real person, and I wouldn't, then I probably shouldn't throw darts at his effigy. It doesn't show any kind of a heart of love. Cain, in killing his brother Abel, was essentially doing the same thing to God, because men and women are made in the image of God, and if you can't kill God and you hate God, then at least you can try and kill the one who is made in his image. And so the Lord sent him out from his presence, and again, I've already mentioned earlier that he would have had to go out with one of his sisters. Don't understand, how that would all relate, whether or not they were already married. That's entirely possible that was the case. And the Lord showed him even a further grace by putting a mark on him. And the mark is that there would be a sevenfold vengeance on whoever tried to kill Cain at this time. And it all goes back to one particular truth that I started with at the beginning. When the Lord told Adam and Eve that the day you eat from the fruit of the tree, you will surely die. Maybe they didn't completely die. They did begin the process of death. But death came into the world and hit them in ways they never dreamed, in striking their children even before it struck them. And so we ought to take seriously the encouragements and the commands of the Lord, and notice that he is a gracious God, but he certainly means all that he says. Any comments, questions, thoughts on Cain and Abel, and then we'll bow in prayer and be done for the day. You just learned more about that story than you've ever imagined in your life. It's all there. Okay. Thank you, Lord, for this time. Pray that you would help us as we live our lives, that we would worship you with true hearts, worshiping you the ways that you want, that we would never worship you out of spite, and we would never worship you putting forth our own efforts, imagining that I'm such a good singer or such good at whatever we do that's worship of the Lord, when maybe the reality is we might be exalting ourselves more than we're exalting you. And instead, we want to humbly exalt you because we love you. Lord, help us to follow the example of Abel and his love. And we thank you that he was a type of the Lord Jesus Christ, reminding us of the innocence of the one who shed his blood for others. We thank you for that blood this day. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Yes.